Welcome, my friends, back to the fog. In this dark and twisted realm governed by a mad god who plays demented games with innocent lives and savage killers, hatred is the only thing shared here. Hate from survivors to killers and from killers to their quarry. Many of the victims of this realm were spawned and forged by hatred, and none understand this quite like Caleb Quinn, also known as the Deathslinger. Caleb was born to Irish immigrant parents during the Great Western Expansion in America. At this time, there was a great dislike and discrimination towards the Irish, and his father was struggling to find work. Caleb became increasingly interested in his father's engineering tools, and seeing his son's fascination, he began to teach Caleb a few tricks. His father believed the machines and devices his son was creating were harmless and innocent trinkets, but for Caleb they were all born from a dark and angry imagination. The bullies who constantly harassed and belittled Caleb drew out a longing to see vengeance done. His devices, when his father was not looking, began to be built for darker purposes than pleasure, but rather to cause pain. As he got older, his engineering skills were turning so great that some businesses began to put their discrimination aside to hire Caleb. Caleb invented a gun that could fire railroad spikes into the ground and a steam-powered tunneling drill. All of this at the behest of Henry Bayshore, the owner of United West Rail. However, Caleb began seeing his inventions appearing at other businesses and realized that his creations were being sold, his patents being given out without his consent or compensation. Enraged, he attacked Bayshore and fired a railroad spike from his own gun into Bayshore's head. To his horror, though, Bayshore survived. This landed him in Hellshire Penitentiary. An educated man, Caleb became friendly with the prison warden who took an interest in Caleb's engineering skills. So a deal was made between the two men. The warden wanted political capital, and he could get it if he proved an effective prison warden. To do this, he would set Caleb free and ensure that once powerful enough, he'd throw Bayshore in prison for the rest of his life. But in exchange, Caleb would become a bounty hunter and bring in the worst criminals in the area to the prison, and thus help make his prison thrive. Caleb agreed and returned to his workshop to develop his most devastating weapon, a spear gun he called the Redeemer. With this, he could fire a rifle that sent a spear connected to a chain into his target and reel them in. He earned his nickname, the Deathslinger. To protect his asset, the prison warden set free other Irish inmates who had become a part of Caleb's bounty hunting gang known as the Hellshire Gang. And for 6 years they upheld their end of the bargain, dragging in outlaws and criminals. But then came the betrayal. Caleb caught sight of a newspaper clipping that revealed Henry Bayshore had purchased Hellshire Penitentiary. The man who had first betrayed him was now working with the man he thought he could trust, the man who promised to help him get revenge. Caleb lost it. He and his gang stormed Hellshire Prison, finding not only the warden but Bayshore as well. They brutalized both men, beating them until their bones were cracked and their faces bloody. They then left them to the mercy of the very inmates that Caleb had turned in for them. While the prisoners had their fun, Caleb sat down in his old jail cell fuming, hurting, and barely conscious due to his anger. A thick and unnatural fog surrounded him, and when he looked up again he saw a new sight. A long, dusty trail that, at its end, held the figures and shadows of all who had wronged him. The prison warden, the boys who had bullied him in his youth, and Bayshore himself, all mocking him, all stealing from him, all hurting him. He wouldn't be idle anymore. He wouldn't let them escape him. Seeing the hooks all around to serve as their punishment, he got to work, bringing death with the sound of a rifle. Now, I love the Deathslinger's lore. I think that one of the biggest problems that I see in most modern stories about racism or bigotry is that they overplay their hand too often. I think it's important to not only show that bigotry is evil, but to also show what it can do to the victim. It doesn't just leave the victim with trauma or pain, it can turn them into something ugly. I once heard a psychologist say, the power of persuasion is dangerous. If you convince a man that he's a king, he will expect the world to bow to him. If you convince a man that he's a monster, he will destroy everything around him. And if you convince a man that he's a victim, he will resent the world around him. And this is very much what I see in Caleb Quinn. You have this young man who was born to Irish parents in a time when the Irish were greatly discriminated. A genius mind who wanted to invent new things, but his heart was twisted because he was convinced that he was a victim and hated. He was bullied, he was mistreated, he was stolen from, and that resentment turned a genius into a depraved monster. Seeing the horror that Caleb became, it leads one to wonder how things could have been had he been shown common decency. decency. The horror of Caleb's story is not one about what he did necessarily, but one about what he could have become. I think it's also a personal thing for me as well. I have always been drawn to the tragic characters, the one who want to do right and who want to be helpful and supportive, but in the end, circumstances or outlying forces turn them into something ugly, mocking the very compassion and good nature that could have been used for something grand. It's similar to the Spirit or the Nurse, characters who did nothing wrong by their existence and in many respects just wanted a decent life, but the mistreatment of others, the ill turns of fate, or in Caleb's case, the discrimination of others, turned him into something he was never supposed to be. And it begs a few questions. Was Caleb always the Deathslinger deep down, or did the bullies and thieves he suffered from turn him into that? If he was always the Deathslinger, would any of it have mattered? Does discrimination draw out monsters within us, or just teach us to be one? I think that's good writing. It asks a lot of questions, but it still gives us a gripping story, at least from my perspective. But I know y'all don't care about that, so let's talk about his gameplay. The Deathslinger's power is the Redeemer, the name of his spear gun. Pressing and holding the power button allows you to aim down your sight to see your target. Then pressing the attack button fires a spear at your target for you to reel in. Once the target is hooked, they turn to face you. You can then hold down the power button to gradually reel them towards you. While this is going on, the survivor can struggle and move a little to readjust their position. If the survivor is able to struggle out of the chain or use the environment to break it, then the Deathslinger will be stunned briefly, but the survivor will still be injured and suffer from the deep wound status effect. But they cannot be put into the dying state this way. The Deathslinger can avoid the stun by doing a basic attack early. This will break the chain and it won't apply the deep wound status effect, but the Deathslinger will avoid the stun and the survivor will still suffer an injury. However, once the survivor is within striking range, pressing the basic attack will inflict the survivor with deep wound and injure them or down them if they're already injured. After every shot, the Deathslinger must reload the Redeemer, whether he hits or misses. The Deathslinger suffers a movement speed decrease anytime he's reloading and aiming down sights. So, while the Deathslinger has a great range attack, it can come at a price if he misses his shot. The Deathslinger's power is pretty awesome, and a boon for FPS veterans who know how to aim down sight and capitalize on quick-fire hits. And this is something I struggle with, admittedly. My strategy is to run Nurse's Calling or some other aura reading perk, and wait for the survivors to hold still, or to either work on a gen or heal a fellow. Then I'll fire on the stationary survivor's aura. This works out most of the time, but if they start running, I know I'm in for a hell of a rough match. I don't get a lot of luck with the Deathslinger, which is sad since I do like him a lot. Now, aside from his power, the Deathslinger uses 3 unique perks: Gearhead, Dead Man's Switch, and Hex Retribution. Gearhead is a very interesting, if not situational perk. It's not bad necessarily, but like I said, situational. When a survivor loses a health state, Gearhead activates for 30 seconds. In that time, if a survivor succeeds a good skill check on a generator, their aura is revealed to you for 8 seconds. This is a good perk to help down survivors and prevent them from fixing generators, but it does depend on the survivors getting skill checks and that they are on a generator at all. I suppose if they aren't on a gen at all, that's a good thing in and of itself, but still, I suppose that's just my take. A good perk though, I just wish I had more luck with it. Then you have Dead Man's Switch. This one I find is a bit more useful. When a survivor is hooked, this perk activates for 30 seconds. While active, any generator that survivors stop working on is immediately blocked by the entity until the Dead Man's Switch ends. The aura of these generators is revealed in white to the Deathslinger. Now, I like this a bit more than Gearhead because while it is situational and requires the survivors to stop working on a gen, or being worked on one at all, I find that if you hook someone, there will always be those survivors who want to get altruism points and will abandon progress on a gen to save their teammate, which will block the generator for anyone else who wants to work on it, buying me time to know what generator they're targeting and capitalize on that. So I do like Dead Man's Switch. And then finally, Hex Retribution. This perk is also very situational. Again, I think you could say that about all of his perks, but a boon if you like to run Hex perks, huh? See what I did there? Anyway, while this totem is active, anytime a survivor cleanses a totem in the trial, they suffer the Oblivious status effect for 45 seconds. And anytime a Hex totem is cleansed, including this one, all survivor auras are revealed for 15 seconds. This means that much like the Spirit's Hex totem haunting grounds, the destruction of this totem causes a terrible price for the survivors. Sure, you've taken away a minor inconvenience, but you have caused yourself 15 seconds of exposure to the killer. Again, I like the Deathslinger. A very cool looking killer with a unique weapon, some decent perks, and actually good lore. He's definitely in the top tier in terms of overall lore, and I genuinely wish I was better with him. Like I said, I am not good with him at all. That's why I don't have a lot of good footage to show you guys. I certainly think his lore is light years above his arena, which just made so little sense to me. But now that we're done with Chains of Hate, we're moving on to the next chapter, Silent Hill. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm a bit nervous about this one, partly because I know next to nothing about Silent Hill, but I know a lot of y'all are excited for me to talk about it, but that'll be for next time in the fog. See you then.